Hey, everybody. Welcome to this year's SF Indie Fest. It's our 21st year of bringing eclectic and unusual films to the Bay Area from around the world. Tonight, we have really special guest, filmmaker Rodrigo Reyes. Welcome, Rodrigo.
Hey, Chris, it's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your new film 499 with us. As folks might be aware, as they kind of peruse the digital catalog, is in addition to being the writer and director of 499, Rodrigo is this year's Nonfiction Vanguard Award recipient here at SF Indie Fest. You rock, Rodrigo. Outside of making a beautiful film, Rodrigo's had kind of a really kind of interesting, history of kind of taking a really kind of personal, interesting approach to his films. And so this award kind of came about several years ago when our festival's founder, Jeff Ross, was just like, there are a lot of interesting filmmakers out there that are doing great things and they're kind of in the middle of their career. And too often people kind of recognize the first feature person or the person late in their career. And we basically wanted to kind of recognize people when they're doing cool shit and hopefully kind of let them know that and celebrate them. And so the idea behind the award is people who are kind of breaking new ground, both in film and cinema, but also specifically within the documentary environment. And I think for those that have seen 499 or will see it, you'll see how kind of Rodrigo's kind of approached this interesting story in this kind of hybrid format, in the sense that it's both kind of a narrative and a documentary film, and is really interesting. So obviously we're living in a little bit of a different environment now with the pandemic, and while film festivals weren't really ever started, that they weren't the kind of same sort of in-person, there's supposed to be these kind of in-person communal experiences. We're glad to be able to kind of celebrate with you virtually. So be on the lookout for a big bottle of champagne in the mail, as we like to treat our award recipients like rock stars. So thanks again, Rodrigo.
Thank you. It's a real honor, and I'm just, I'm feeling the love.
Awesome. When we kind of are looking to kind of, honor folks, the main thing is that we're wanting people that are kind of doing things differently, and they're kind of willing to kind of take risks, but the risks also kind of result in some really successful and interesting art. And I keep on going back to this word, interesting, just because I think that not only are watching your films, experiences that are very, very immersive, they also get you to kind of think. I mean, in the sense that in a regular world, after we've watched your film, with I'll go head to the bar or on a date at a restaurant, we'd be kind of talking about it. And so hopefully people will continue to do that online. And so maybe as we kind of dig into 499, can you tell me a little bit about what inspired you to kind of take on such a concept?
I've always been in love with the idea of history and like what our relationship is with history. My dad's a history teacher, and in Mexico, he would take me out to museums and to outings, like visiting archaeological sites, like where these amazing civilizations flourished. And I'm talking like 4 or 5 years old. So very early on, I had this like ingrained in me that there's this like fascinating relationship that we have with history, and like, even though it's in the past, it still has some echoes in our present day. And so as I grew up, I became more and more interested in making films, and I realized that this anniversary was like coming up, and I just felt like there was a challenge there as a filmmaker to try to make a film that makes sense somehow of this really crazy moment that has been kind of like ingrained so deeply in Mexican consciousness, in our imaginarium, like this idea that somehow we were conquered, and there's like this like big bang moment 500 years ago. So that's my brain, my cinematic brain started spinning along with my this very kind of personal love for history. And slowly, like, these ideas started coming together as I talked to my producers and stuff. It's like, well, how do you make an interesting film? How do you do something around this anniversary that isn't just like a something you'll see on Discovery Channel, which is great. I love those, very educational, more like didactic documentaries. But how do you do something different, And so this idea of this ghost, this conquistador that comes back from the 16th century, and he has to like kind of retrace his steps through Mexico, through his path of conquest, is that just felt so fascinating to me. And that very simple idea of taking one actor with a period costume and having him interact with real life, all of a sudden that detonated all of these like crazy connections, to reality. And so yeah, like there was like this little engine that developed in the movie, this concept that just, we would take it out into the world, and the movie would start building around the concept.
When you kind of jumped in, I guess thinking about things in kind of two ways. One is like, it's such an epic film, and I mean, both in this kind of story and themes it's exploring, but also the way that you've captured it visually. Is that, how did you kind of get people? You have this huge team of people that kind of obviously helped make your film possible. So it's like, how did you win them over? Once you had this concept, because I mean, it's one thing to kind of pitch some sort of like kind of big budget Hollywood movie, of like, okay, well, we're just going to throw it all at it. But with such a unique concept, like, did people just kind of buy into the kind of idea, your vision of it, or what were some of the kind of challenges that you ran into as to kind of pitching what is kind of an unusual idea?
I think the greatest challenge with a hybrid film is that we're educated to read movies like, oh, this is a documentary, it's supposed to be true. This is a fiction, it's supposed to feel like it's true, and we enjoy that, that somebody made us feel that it's true. But we know like there's this difference, and when you do a hybrid film, you're stepping all over those toes. You're creating like this situation where people's like interpretation doesn't know where to go, right? Like, well, is this true? I need to know if it's true or not. And so that challenge was part of my pitch. And so really I can say that everyone who joined the movie was in love with the concept, and everyone who hated it, just, we couldn't collaborate. And that goes down to the real people that the conquistador meets along the way, because he meets, actual victims of modern violence, and I had to talk to them about the concept of the film and explain, you know my thesis or my idea, right? And like that was very enriching and humbling for me, because I realized, often we go out and make a film and we're the authorities and we know where the story's going and all that, but to have to explain it to somebody before, and in detail, and say, hey, you should join this adventure, because your story of your father who was murdered for being a journalist, for instance, like it connects to this long arc of violence that spans 500 years of history. And that taught me so much about trusting people, and trusting regular people to give me feedback and to listen to them, and to kind of like work with that ego that we have as filmmakers, because we're like, we're specialists, right? We're like the professionals. But really, like, with this movie, we're embedding a fantasy into real life, and so we had to also listen. And that's what helped ultimately, is just trusting the stories. um and I think, you know people have asked me, well, why didn't you just like tell the stories of the regular people without having the conquistador there? But that's the whole point, right? Because the fiction helps us reach other ideas about real life. And so once that clicked with anyone on the team, then we could work together, and really amazing things would happen, and people would help, and contribute along this journey. And for folks as they watch the film, the whole thing was shot chronologically, so we had like this experience as a team, and as a crew of meeting all of these folks, in order and kind of building the story together.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting 'cause I remember you talking with me about the idea early on, and being familiar with, yourself as a filmmaker and your work. I was like, well, Rodrigo is going to come back with something interesting. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to be, but it's going to be cool, and it surpassed anything that I could have ever imagined. And so when you were out there in the field with, the actor that's playing the conquistadors, like, do you think that helped, like, kind of as a totem, create a different sort of connection with some of the people that you met and interviewed, or freed them up to kind of share in a different way than if you'd approached it in a normal documentary manner, if just, you interviewed
Well,
them?
I think the problem of approaching, like, you talk to someone who's been victimized by a system, right? Like, whose family has been disappeared or whose culture is being eroded. If you only talk to them, about that, and you don't put us into a wider perspective, you're kind of limiting that story, And what I love about 499 is that you know the folks in the story are part of like 500 years of history. They're not limited to just being victims today. They're actually conversing with history. And so that was like the key, like how, like, the having the conquistador there always detonated this idea of bearing witness. And that is so powerful, right? Like, because the structures of control and power, like, there's the fundamental trait there is like not listening, not having to listen. I am power, I don't need to listen to you, and we're seeing that play out every day here in America. There's lack of listening, this total indifference, and the power to be indifferent, right? And so having the conquistador there created this dialogue with like somehow with the structures of power and authority, you know even though it was fictional, it's still always, with an interview, we would always go with this idea of like, well, what do you want him to hear? What do you want him to listen to about
Mm.
your life? And that was very valuable. And it wasn't like a confrontation. It was like everybody was aware this guy, he doesn't understand like his role in this system. And it's through listening to people that he will come to some sort of new perspective. And I know that's a tough thing to hear, because we don't feel like, we don't feel like talking to people that we disagree with. But I think that when you've been victimized to that level, like, that's the real struggle, is to just even be heard. Mexico's numbers of violence in terms of violence are ridiculously high, and so there's millions of stories of people who are not being heard. So that kind of set it up. And so the actor was really enjoying that process of playing that role, and being welcomed in a very kind of humane way, or like, with the spirit of hopefully sharing something, even if he had been a part of all these horrible things.
Do you think it was kind of cathartic in some way for the kind of interview participants, or how did, like, what was their reaction after these interviews? Because I mean, obviously, it's a kind of a being interviewed itself is it's a different experience for many of us, but then you have this actor in front of you. I mean, what was some of the feedback that you got after these scenes were shot?
Well, we spent a lot of time with many of the real people, sometimes days,
Mm.
and sometimes I've been talking to them for months. So I think what I know was a good takeaway for folks was this idea of like, you know, being part of a different process that isn't just like a quick, item in a newspaper. It's like an artistic project where there's room to talk and to listen and to really kind of meditate on a lot of the deeper issues, behind their stories. At the same time, like, all of the stories are still active. They're still, folks are still searching for their loved ones, fighting for justice. And I've stayed in touch with most of the people in the film. And so, like, years after we shot this thing, they're still going on their journey. So, you know, I learned early on, with other projects, that when you enter someone's life that has been impacted by so much trauma, you have to also be very clear and humble and say, hey, this is just a film. Um, I'm going to do the best I can to bring my art to your story. But I understand and acknowledge that you will have to continue living with this, afterwards.
Mm.
Um, you know, and I think people appreciate that because we can't, you know, we can't go into their lives and just, with this hero's mindset that somehow telling these stories will fix like such a complex issue as justice in Mexico. Like, I think that's so pretentious. But this morning I was texting with like three of them actually because we're going to collaborate to bring the film to their communities in
Mm.
Mexico this year with outdoor free screenings. So, we remain in contact, and it's also a learning experience for me as a filmmaker to kind of let go of this idea that my movie will change the world. I think we all kind of have that in the documentary world, and we kind of need to be a little more humble.
And well, that's such an interesting way to have approached it in regards to your relationship with your subjects. For those of us that are kind of less familiar with kind of Mexican culture and history, um, like what's the role that kind of history plays in regards to awareness on like the ground of like, if you met a regular family or regular person in Mexico, is this kind of sense of history something that's more present in people's lives than, you know, at least I would say for American culture, often, history is this thing that's not often thought about, you're just kind of moving forward. And is there kind of a larger presence, I guess, of history and awareness, among people, would you say?
I don't know if there's an awareness. I would just say that there's this, presence of like all these historical moments that coexist in Mexico.
Hmm.
Like we still, we're very hyper aware that we were colonized, or that this territory was colonized, but the interpretations of that are very diffuse.
Hmm.
And so I think like the conquistador himself, is like a very ambiguous character, and he generates a lot of questions. There's not a lot of answers in the film. It's like this constant questioning, and then you start wondering, well, where am I, like in this position, as these people tell the stories to the camera, are they telling it to me? Have I ignored these stories? What is the relationship between violence today and violence in the past? So I think it generates a lot of questions. We definitely have an imaginarium of this idea of the conquest, right? And it has been, used by governments across the 20th century to kind of create this sense of like, Mexicans were the victims of this great injustice, this conquest. But the truth is much more complicated than that, right? Like we still speak the language of Spain, and we Mexico is largely Catholic. Um, so I think more than anything, that the movie serves as like this kind of like this very persevering kind of stimuli, it just stimulation to the audience to really kind of consider where they lie on this flow of history. And I think, in the US, like, we don't know a lot about history, I guess. But the big conversation is about history all the time, right? Like, we don't want things to change, or we do want things to change.
Hmm.
We want to repair this wrong, or we want to ignore it or minimize it, right? Like, look at the last summer in America, right? History was all over the place there, you know. And so I think all of us have a very complex relationship to our past, and we use it. We use our past every day to justify why we do the things we do, you know, even if we don't have a complex reading of it. And I think that's where it's painful. It's to actually look at the reality of history, and what it has led to today. It's a very uncomfortable position to be in. It's no wonder that people don't want, to change the statues, even if they don't know like the name of the person the Confederate general, like, or whatever. Like, they don't want to change it because it's like it gives us this sense of like of stability and of being right, you know. And we're so afraid to kind of break through that. Um, and so I hope that when people watch it here from the U.S. perspective, that they'll see that parallel to our own history.
Yeah, and I guess it makes me, think of with the kind of the introduction of the conquistador in your visual elements, like how did you decide to kind of craft this visual language in the sense of it being such a, I guess, what's the technical term? I guess you guys didn't shoot in CinemaScope, but this kind of very widescreen sort of epic aspect that you would associate with a film like Lawrence of the Arabia River, in the sense that what decided you kind of embrace these kind of visual approaches in the sense of how did you want to kind of immerse people in a world that felt different than real life, or what was the kind of impetus for deciding to kind of embrace the kind of cinematographic approach that you took with the film?
Well, like this widescreen, anamorphic lenses, these very epic look. That's how Hollywood has talked about history in the past, right? Like in from Gladiator to Spartacus, all these movies are like important movies are like very wide, and so the idea of taking that out into the streets and capturing reality with that perspective, that's something that the cinematographer kind of like brought to my to my attention and offered as an idea. And we had a lot of conversations about it because it felt very difficult for me as a director to kind of think in that canvas. But his argument was, well, we're going to appropriate this language and take it out of the Hollywood epic and bring it to the truth, to the real world, and it'll help us make this conquistador's journey feel organic, like, because my goal was for the film not to feel like a pastiche of, here we have the fiction and here we have the reality. It had to feel
Mm.
like it was all part of the same world, and you were entering a very new and strange world with this movie, and that it wasn't completely real and it wasn't completely fake. And that language helped for that. And I think, like, it's an epic journey. It's not a glorious journey, it's just epic. It covers like really big landscapes and really big blocks of time and big ideas. Um, but in a way it's also very very humbling, right? Because the conquistador doesn't ride triumphant into Mexico City. Like, he's sinking into this personal hell through the whole movie. Um, and what I love about the lenses and the language of the movie is that like, we were able to create this sense of like epicness with just working with the real world, working with regular like ambient light, and just really working with what the world was offering, and kind of navigating this character in that world. When he's like walking down an overpass, or he's like hiking up a mountain, there isn't much artifice there. It's just like the point of view of the movie, like, here comes this
Mhm.
character, and we take him seriously, and I just love that about the film. And I think many people, when they watch it, it just feels like a dream. It has this very dreamlike quality that is very enchanting, you know and that's what history really is. It's like it's real and unreal at the same time. Like, we have to think about it for it to feel real, right? We have to remind ourselves that it's in the background because it's a ghost. It's not, time has passed. So it's not immediately present, but it's like right there underneath the surface.
Awesome. Well, as we kind of work to kind of wrap things up, to just kind of take things back to you as a filmmaker, where do you kind of see 499 in the place of some of your other work, and the other films that you're working on, in the sense of like, are there kind of shared themes that you see yourself exploring, or approaches, and like what's up for you next for this movie, and also what else are you working on?
Well, I'm really when I look at 499, I think, well, like, I like to make movies about trips, and I like to make movies set in the real world, but I like to provoke something. Like I don't just want to stand by and document. I want to provoke some sort of, there's got to be a little something that makes you want to look, or something that some idea that maybe you have to bring out. In this case, with a fictional conquistador. So I'm also just really interested in like what happens when you don't play by the rules. Like, can you get at the thing that you want to tell if you break the rules, or are the rules in the way, or are the rules helping you? Um, and so I'm working on a project now about a friend of mine who's incarcerated, and he's doing life in prison without parole, and the rules of the game for him in terms of being a part of a movie is that he cannot be interviewed. I can't really record him. Um, there's no archival material. So the very system kind of made it almost impossible to make a good film about him if you played by all the rules, right? Um, and so that provoked this need to kind of figure out uh, what what was the path to get to his story. Could we use fiction to get at the truth? And I think that's kind of what I've learned over the last 10 years of making movies, is this idea of like, you have to listen to the story and let it speak to you. How do you get at the thing that you want to explore? And that's when I start thinking about what rules I kind of getting in the way, and what stuff helps us, right? So with this other project, fiction really allowed us to kind of bring my friend's letters to life in a way that we couldn't otherwise, you know? And so it developed into this really interesting project where his own family is helping to recreate his memories of his life. And as he tells his life story, we kind of see how there's all these intersections of systemic breakdowns. Like there's the issue of poverty, the issue of immigration, and then the criminal justice system all kind of coincide in his life. And if we were to just play it straight, then his story would never be told. you know and so in a way, like, just taking this weird you know like circuit around the limitations really helped to make his portrait that much more honest. So I love that about cinema, because it's a language. It's not there isn't anything set in stone of how we use the language, and sometimes we need to make those extra connections. And I love it when people also they watch a movie and they're like, wow, it really makes sense. That's the thing that a lot of people in 499 would say, like the real people. They would say, wow, like this makes sense, like like this character actually makes sense. He does exist. Like I get it. He's real to me. And so I love it when, like, there's like some combination or some unexpected thing that happens, and it makes sense, because we need those extra connections. And that's what we're here for as artists, is to kind of like bend the rules or break them when we have to, so that we make those connections.
Well, I think you've done that beautifully in 499, and thank you again for sharing it with us and our audience at SF Indie Fest. For those of you that aren't familiar, this film is kind of in the middle of its festival run, and it'll be released theatrically, hopefully later in the year, and hopefully with some live person events, hopefully at the Roxy and other places around the Bay Area. So after you watch this beautiful film, please make sure to kind of spread the word on social media and be on the lookout for its return to the Bay Area later this year, and we can all celebrate with Rodrigo then. So thanks again for making a wonderful movie.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, SFND.
Cool. Thank you, Rodrigo. This is the first Q&A of SF Indie Fest for this year, so thanks for rolling with the punches. We'll make sure to keep getting the word out about things. You've had a couple interviews with the press so far, is that right?
I had Diablo magazine. That's what I had. And
okay,
then
and I think there's a Chronicle one.
She told me that there's more coming. So I'm standing by. I am like going to be editing, so I think we'll be able to find a schedule.
Okay, cool. I know the Chronicle for I think the Pink section was going to do one, and I think there's a couple other ones coming down the pipeline. So Karen and her team will keep you posted about that.
Okay, cool. Anything you
Um,
need, I mean, I'm happy to do it. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the conversation, and I always think that you have such a cool take on the way that you make your films, and I think it's really great for people to be able to kind of hear the maker behind it, because I think this is the sort of film after you see it, you're kind of entranced by it, and you just kind of, it raises a lot of questions in a good way. And when people can kind of, see the way that you're thinking, I think it just keeps people just kind of going down that rabbit hole of thinking about these ideas and thinking about these ideas, not just in a, an issue or a subject way, but just also the way that we see art, and that the idea that, like, when we're making, films, that there's so many different ways to make films, and it's all depends on, the person behind it and the way that they decide to approach it.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just I try to fight for that process of like just listening to something, what it needs, and just building the project on that. Um, at the same time, it's like exhausting. I didn't want to get into it on the Q&A, but like the funding for 499 was really tough because
Yeah.
people just, like they were like no, and I'm like, well, I know I'm right, and someone else will do something like this, and
Mm-hmm.
in a few years that you do believe in, and it'll be really frustrating. So we had to just figure out hook or by crook to make the movie. But I feel like at a certain point it's becoming personally exhausting to do that. Like
Yeah.
so I don't know. I'm hoping that with Sanson things will be a little bit more because it has ITVS, that it'll be able to kind of like be more of a calling card, you know.
Mm.
I think 499 is that, but I think like to message the industry,
Right.
is the key. You know what I'm talking about. It's just like
Oh,
hard
absolutely. Yeah.
to
Well,
break
I
into the room.
I think I forgot who I was having to talk about with this recently. Oh, I know it is. It was doing an interview for the SUP podcast, and one of the kind of misperception that I had about the documentary film industry, the film industry early on, is I was like, oh well, different or unique films are rewarded if you do them well, because those are the ones that you do that enter your consciousness. But the thing that you realize is that those are the hardest films to make, and so it's like if they've made it into the world, then of course you're going to be aware of them. But it's like there's a lot of dead bodies on the side of the road leading up to it. But like you see these filmmakers, I mean, just legendary documentary filmmakers, and you figure, okay, well, of course your people being rewarded for the individualism, and it's like, no, that's definitely not the way that it goes. But you might have heard this. There was an interview or an anecdote many years ago that I'd read about with Fellini and Scorsese, and Martin Scorsese had met Fellini maybe in the late 70s or something like that, and like Fellini was having a hard time like getting funding for one of his films, and it's just like it was one of these things where it's just like, wait, like Fellini, like why is he having a hard time? Like, and it was kind of one of those things where he told Scorsese, of like, he's like, look, it gets easier. He's like, but he's like, I'm always trying to do something different, and so it's like I could, if I did the same thing over and over again, it'd be easier to get people on board. But when you keep on trying to do different things, each one is kind of a new fight, in that sort of way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to get more into scripted because of that, like because I want to kind of have maybe some freedom to tackle certain ideas that I think in documentary it's become kind of an uphill pitch at times. But yeah, I'm not naive. I know that has its own challenges as well, and I wonder if it'll translate like some of this hybrid work into that move.
I would imagine so.
hopefully. But I mean, at the end of the day, it is a tough, it's a tough business, man. And
Yeah.
you know, we just have to persevere in that faith that art matters. But sometimes you're just like, man, like it's a dark day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and obviously everybody's priorities change over time too. It's like things that you might not have thought that you would want to do at some point in time. You're like, oh, well, this is an interesting challenge, and it might be a different creative challenge than you expected, but sometimes doing something that's a challenge, but also you're given the challenge isn't coming from like having to make your dream a reality, but the challenge is to work in with whatever the parameters are.
Yeah.
Can be fun.
Yeah.
I just think of like so many documentary filmmakers that get into kind of scripted TV, like scripted fiction TV. And it's just like, I mean, directing an hour-long episode for a Netflix show isn't easy, and it might not be your creation, but like, it must be a fun challenge, in the sense of like what you can do.
Yeah, and I'm more interested in like like more like the indie film landscape. Like I think that the equation for the pitch is just different. Like it's like who's your talent, what's the story, what's the genre. Whereas
Right.
documentary, there's also a lot of ethical. Like with 499, there was a lot of ethical pushback, as if somehow the film was unethical for having this conquistador or for being more directed than a verite documentary. And I've had that argument too many times, and I feel like unless I have like unless like for instance Sanson does really well, like it's going to be hard for people to just be like, oh, just trust it, it's going to work out. But who knows? I mean, we're optimistic. I can't wait to show you this new project.
Cool. Yeah.
It's going to be really interesting to hear your take. And you'll be talking to me and my editing team, and one of them, she's from Chile, so
Okay.
like it'll be interesting,
Nice.
like to have that kind of international perspective of how they see film and how we
Yeah.
see it. It's like so different.
Yeah, absolutely, especially with the subject matter. Well, I obviously hope for the best with you with everything, but anything I can always do. Sorry, my brain's not quite there today. Anything that you ever need, just give me a shout out. But I think having both these films coming out around the same time could be a nice kind of 1-2 punch for you.
Yeah, hopefully. And I'm learning about the ITVS system, which is actually really interesting.
Yes.
And I've never had a film with them, so.
Who's your supervising producer?
Shauna.
Okay, I haven't met Shauna before, so. Okay,
yeah, she's great. She's great. She's like always been very supportive. I've heard of other people that have like crazy experiences.
Oh yeah. We'll have to swap some ITVS stories. I won't say that ours was bad. It just that his personality just like didn't quite line up with the way that like indie filmmakers work, and so he's very much a tough love person. And so later on, it's like good cop, bad cop, and you're like, I could have used some of the good cop earlier on. It's like leading with the bad cop didn't help. Is not a very is not an incentivization in the way my personality is, at least.
Yeah, I don't like that either. I want to feel like people are game. I don't want to feel like I have to constantly convince people. But we'll be working hard, and I think Sue will be on the call too. So
nice. Okay.
It'll be great to talk about that. And let me know if you need anything else for SF Indie.
I will do. I'll keep you posted about things, and then I'll probably reach out you via email or text here in the next week or so.
All right, Chris. Well, have a great week.
Okay, thanks, man. See ya.
Bye.